Today, Charts Today comes to you from a cricket ground in Queensland, Australia. And you might be asking yourself, what am I doing standing here on a cricket ground with a cricket ball? What's that got to do with Charts Today? Well, I'm out for my morning walk and I thought I would just demonstrate the concept of the targets to you. So basically, the initial move in a thrust gives you the ultimate, determines the furthest we go from the target. So if I hold my arm here and throw, it's not going to go very far. But if I hold my arm all the way back here and then I throw, it's going to go a lot further. And that's how the targets work. Just remember that first initial thrust is what determines how far we go. The bigger that first thrust, the bigger the target. That's how it works. Okay, so I'm back at home. It's Friday the 5th of January, first week of the year just coming to an end. And I thought I'd look at things that have got big thrusts at the moment. So let's just focus on that. So here we see the euro. This is the 60-minute chart, short term, and the daily chart. We see here on the euro that we had this thrust here. That's that first initial move. And that's the resulting target. We had a bigger thrust to the downside here, but because we haven't activated that, that is still orange. So interesting at the moment that the euro is above the cloud on the daily, and we've got this target some 8% higher to 118 against the dollar. We are in a short-term downtrend, so we'll be watching for short-term targets there. So that's really quite interesting. Some of the other big targets, if we look at Bitcoin, here we see the daily chart on Bitcoin, and this one is really big. Here we've got sort of moves of about 10,000. This is a log scale Bitcoin chart, so this is log scale targets, and 10,000 gives us another move up to 61,000, and then another target here, and these targets are quite big, leading to targets. And notice how this target was given before, not quite met, but given back in February, back at 25,000, saying 50,000. We're now 45,000, we're getting closer. So that's just shows you the train tracks that we're seeing on those targets there. So that's really quite significant. Now looking at the Nasdaq, we see here on the daily chart that we had these targets through last year, giving us upside targets. There was the thrust. There's the resultant move. That's the first throw of the ball, if you like. That's where you pull your arm back, and that's the extent of the move. This target is bigger because this little thrust here was not so big. So bigger thrust, bigger target. Interestingly, we don't have any new upside targets on the daily chart for the Nasdaq, but we do have now this downside target, and that's really significant. That move lower, and that move there is what gives us the resultant thrust, and that's saying another 3% lower on the Nasdaq on the 60-minute chart, and we are below the cloud. Notice how these upside targets were given and met. Now we're below the cloud. And if we look at the S&P mini, similar picture here where we had this upside targets given, bigger target given, nearly met. It took a lot longer to be met than that 2 to 1 times price to time, but interestingly we did get there, and now we just don't have any new targets there and on the short term, so we'd be waiting for those targets to kick in as well. Now looking at some of the other global markets, if we look at Japan, really good strong upside targets here, looking very different from the US. Upside targets there on the daily. That thrust there is what generates that target. It's activated. We have to have a pullback and then a move higher by units, 0.5%. And the same here. This is on the 60-minute chart. We see that move higher, we pull back, and then we move higher again. So really, really significant there. And if we look at China, we see here we've got very clear downside targets. This is on the daily chart. Thrust target given. That target nearly met the previous one, this one here, and on the 60-minute chart, downside targets. We do have a little relief rally, but we have to move higher to activate that target. And so that's really quite key there. If we look at India, this market really quite clear, really big upside targets there for India. Notice that the strength of that uninterrupted buying thrust, that's pulling the arm back, and then we pull back and then we go higher. That activates an upside target, so I'm 27% higher. And we can actually go to the weekly chart, and we see here we've got these targets again on the weekly, really looking very strong indeed. The Indian market off to a good start there for the year. That's the longer term chart, of course, being the weekly. And then if we look at the Aussie market, we see here big thrust move off the low in October, giving us an upside target. We didn't quite get there. We did exceed the targets on the 60-minute chart, so that's really quite interesting there. Target given, took a long time to activate, a couple of weeks to activate, but then these targets are given, and then this one generating a new one. We went higher than the target, so that's bullish short term. We are coming under pressure now on the cloud, so that's really, again, quite interesting. Taking a look at gold, we see here the gold gave this really big upside thrust in October. That was activated, giving us a target to 23.93. But we do have a downside target at the moment, a little new upside one given here. And if we move higher, we activate that back to 2070. So really quite interesting to see these targets on gold. And there's a big one still in place here, but that's becoming less and less important as time goes on. And that's really the key there. So gold is looking very strong indeed. If we look at US 10-year yields, again, we had this big targets that were given and met. A little mini downside one. We went back below the cloud. We hit 3.8% in the US 10-year yield. We've got this thrust now that's been activated, and we're pushing higher, and we've got a target here of 4.19%, some 4.5% higher. So that's again quite a big thrust move on the short-term chart. And of course, we have pulled back very much so on the daily. Very interesting if we look at some of the tech stocks. We saw that Nasdaq chart. Here we look at Apple. So Apple has had a really bad start to the year. If we look at the daily chart, these were the thrust targets that were given. There was one there, and then another one off this low. This thrust target's given and met. So that's really significant, but really struggling to get above that $200 level. There's just really strong resistance there on Apple. And if we look at the 60-minute chart, we see here the move lower. The target's met in the short term and then really falling away. That's bearish confirmation back to around 181 there. So really significant. And if we look at Microsoft, just nudging Apple now, really interesting. Apple's got a market cap of 2.83 trillion. Microsoft's got a market cap of 2.73 trillion, only 5% difference. We've said last year at the end of the year that 2024 could be the year that Microsoft overtakes Apple to become the US's biggest company. And it's really interesting that the chart here is not looking as bad as it is on Apple. An upside target and the downside target not yet activated. So significant there. Now, if we take a quick look at some of the energy mix, Brent crude is a very interesting one as well. We've got this upside target here, waiting for this new one to be activated on the medium-term chart. And again, if we go to the daily chart here, we see those downside targets that were given, then new upside targets there, and then little downside targets, and we're just waiting for this one to be activated. We're not quite above the cloud, so it's still too early to call. Ideally, we'll see that 90 resistance level broken, so really significant there. And if we look at the 60-minute chart, we see here that move and then the target on the 60-minute, suggesting that this target will possibly break and be activated. So that's where the 60-minute can be really, really valuable to you as well. And if we look at the US NatGas chart, we see here, similarly, we've got these upside targets. Notice here how these downside targets were met. They were given quite a long time ago on the daily, little new upside targets, but the 60-minute is where the action is if you're short-term trading Henry Hub. And we see here a target of 306, that's 9% higher, upside targets and above the cloud and breaking the resistance, so really significant. So just remember, those thrusts are what generate the target. That uninterrupted thrust is what generates the target. Off a low, it's an upside target. Off a high, it's a downside target, and that's how the targets work. That's it for today. Have a great weekend. I'm back in Asia on Monday and then London middle of the week. Look forward to seeing you then. Bye for now.